So let's continue with another issue, big issue I want to also give an overview on, which is I/O. We already talked about this last time, so let's look into the individual aspects in a little more detail. We already talked about that touch screens are less precise and less fast also than a keyboard, for example, because you don't have tactile feedback. There are some projects working on that. So for example, you can buy a special kind of iPhone or iPad case which has these sort of bubbles in the screen which you can inflate basically. So you can actually feel the keys while typing, but you can already probably think of a reason why this isn't such a big thing, because as soon as Apple even slightly changes the layout on their keyboard, you can basically throw the whole thing away because you can't move the bubbles, of course. Then one other big issue when using a touchscreen is occlusion, of course. So because your hand and your fingers will simply cover part of the display. This is not a problem with a mouse pointer, of course, because that's very small. But with touch, you kind of have to keep this in mind when you actually design the layout of the user interface, because otherwise you might just put things where people usually can't read them when they touch some spot. And you have less precision because your finger is just a lot bigger than most of the targets of this, on the screen. And the way this is usually solved is to either use some sort of handle, which is a lot larger than the individual character, for example, you're trying to touch, and also use some kind of larger menu which has an offset. So together, these two techniques kind of help to deal with this precision issue. But still, if you're trying to do something like a technical drawing, for example, then this is probably something you don't want to do on a touchscreen. This is something you still want to do with a mouse, because over longer periods of time, it's simply very exhausting to try and adjust pixel-wise things on a touchscreen, even if you use all these extra techniques. Then one very big issue in touch interfaces in general is the so-called Midas touch problem. This is named after this Greek king of legend, I think, Midas, and everything he touched turned to gold, including his food and his relatives and so on, which kind of turned into a curse. And it's similar with touch. You can't just, like with the mouse, you can just hover over individual elements and, for example, get a tooltip that tells you what it's actually going to do. That's not possible with touch. One sort of solution, which is usually used in most interfaces today, is that the action only happens when you lift your finger. So you can still kind of reconsider if you've touched an UI object but didn't move your finger off yet, then you can often move it away from the object and then release it, and then nothing will happen. But this is not quite the same thing. Sometimes actions are also triggered by long press. So if you press shortly, then you select something, and if you press for a longer period of time, then you trigger some kind of menu or some other sort of action. But so the vocabulary you have to interact with a touchscreen is a little less complex than you have on a desktop once again. People sometimes try to solve that by using gestures, but this is also a very wide area. So, for example, I think on iOS in the mail application, you can, if you press on an email entry and then swipe right, then you delete it, and then if you swipe left, then you do something else. And I absolutely can't remember which is which, because I'm not using it daily, and when I have an iOS device and want to do something with it, then I'm inevitably doing the wrong thing first and deleting something I wasn't intending to delete and so on. So gestures are kind of a two-edged sword. So they give you more options to do something on the touchscreen, but on the other hand, how do you actually communicate to people what gestures they have? So, and what's also kind of an overused term is that it's natural interaction or natural gestures, but there's lots of studies that show you that it's actually very different between individual people what they consider a natural gesture or an intuitive gesture. And yeah, last but not least, we don't really have any standards, so not just between Android and iOS, but even each individual app can have its completely own set of gestures. What does a left and a right swipe mean, and maybe what do I do when I rotate two fingers, or when I do pinch zoom. Pinch zoom is actually the one thing that's kind of universally accepted. So in any kind of map or image or whatever else viewer, if you do this pinch gesture, then it in almost all cases means to zoom in and out. But that's kind of the only thing which just about everybody can agree on. So gestures are, once again, kind of two-edged thing. All right, what else? So what we need to keep in mind also when thinking about interaction with mobile devices is bimanual interaction. So this is, of course, something we as humans do all the time. And there's two classes. One is the symmetric one, where we do the same thing with both hands, like holding the device and typing a message, for example. Or we have the asymmetric use, where one hand is just like holding whatever we are interacting with, and the other hand is doing the actual interaction. Now the problem is that often you actually need your other hand for something else, like maybe you're in the bus and need to hold on to the railing. So that then immediately turns into unimanual interaction. And especially if you have a larger device or small hands, then you will usually already have noticed that it's actually quite difficult to do things only with your thumb from time to time. And that leads to all sorts of weird workarounds people come up with, and all sorts of phone holders that you see from time to time, like these sockets you can glue on the back. If that really makes a difference, kind of depends on personal preference, I guess. But this is also something we need to keep in mind when we develop mobile applications in general, because people might actually not be able to sit down and use two hands to interact with our application all the time. So this is something worth considering. One alternative, of course, would be to use speech. We can use speech for input, for something like hands-free dialing when we're driving in a car, or we can, of course, have assistants like Siri and Google Now and so on. So this is actually something I was wondering about for quite some time. I've personally almost never used somebody use Siri like you see in the commercial, where people just pull out their phone and start talking to Siri wherever they are. Maybe it's a cultural difference. Maybe this is less pronounced in Europe. I don't know. It's just something that I've seen, or I've not seen happening in public actually. On the other hand, speech output, same thing. If I'm already talking to Google Assistant, then of course it will respond with voice or Alexa or whatever. But the main use case that everybody is familiar with, as far as I've seen it at least, is car navigation. So yeah, this is maybe a question for you. Is this something is this biased by my personal perception? Are you using like Siri and Google Assistant and so on in public? Anyone? Yeah.
I think the issue is about the privacy.
Yes, for example.
When you use like Siri in public, then everyone
Mhm.
device. So only at home maybe.
Yeah, okay, that's maybe a good point. Actually, at home I also like, well, I have an Alexa speaker and I use that to listen to radio. Okay, yeah, that's it mostly. Okay, so yeah, maybe this is really a cultural thing that, yeah.
But I think the privacy issue is only in Europe or maybe the rest of the world. Because
Mhm.
U.S. people usually do use these outside of the building.
Maybe it's really that, because so I guess the Siri commercial was designed in the US, so for that reason maybe it's really like a bit of a cultural difference here. All right, any other questions, comments? Yeah, let's continue. We have, just as a brief summary, what other I/O channels do we have? We also have motion, of course. Motion as an output is a kind of an uncommon concept. The only thing a regular phone can do as output in terms of motion is vibration. But there's all sorts of weird concept devices that actually like inflate and deflate to communicate some kind of like the more messages you have, the thicker your phone gets and so on. So this is also sort of like motion as an output channel, and we'll talk about other aspects of that and other research projects also later on. Then we have motion as an input, of course. This is probably familiar to anyone who's ever played something like a racing game, for example. So we have this inertial measurement unit in our devices, which usually is a combination of acceleration sensor, magnetic sensor, and gyroscope. These three together are often called an IMU. And one important thing to keep in mind is that it can only sense a relative position. So if I basically have a starting position and then move my phone up by 1 meter or something like that, then this is something the IMU can sense, but it cannot tell the difference if I started here on the table or if I started on the floor. So there's no absolute position in there. If I have an application which requires absolute position, then I would need to use something like GPS on top of that to figure out where I actually am, and then I can add the relative movement which the IMU can sense on top of that. Also, if I have anything generating magnetic fields in the environment, and that can even be something as simple as the steel in the wall again, that can of course also be slightly magnetic, or I can just, if I'm walking by a car on the street, the car is a big body of metal which can also like generate a little bit of its own magnetic field, then that can interfere with the compass in the IMU. Yeah, so these are things to keep in mind when using motion as an input. What other channels do we have? We have vision, of course. Vision can be an input channel again. We use the camera. We can do things like recognize text in the environment. We can scan barcodes. We can do SLAM, simultaneous localization and mapping. That means I'm moving my device, and from the differential movement between two camera images, I can then calculate the structure of the environment. Problem here always is that many research projects working in this space are based in the lab and have very stable environment conditions. But as soon as you basically take it into the real world and simply go outside, for example, then it gets a lot more difficult, because if you need to deal with just the difference between sunlight and shade, for example, that's already quite hard for many computer vision algorithms. On the other hand, of course, we have actually the primary output channel of our mobile device, which is the display. We have a very high information density on there. We have usually something like full HD on this very small screen, so we could display a lot of information, but of course we don't want to squint at our screens all the time. So I need to come up with some way to visualize, to arrange the information in such a way that it's still digestible in a sense. And once again, I also have to deal with the environment, with bright light, for example. So do I want my display to actually be able to be still readable in sunlight? Then I, of course, need a very high maximum brightness. And if I have the same brightness setting and I'm reading at night, then it would probably hurt my eyes. So I need some kind of adjustable brightness sensor, also something most devices have. And last but not least, if I basically combine both visual input and output into one application, then I'm getting something like augmented reality. For example, like the Google Translate app, where you can look at a bit of text in a foreign language, and then ideally inside the camera image, it's translated into a different language, which you then can read directly in the image. All right. What other channels can we use? We sometimes have biosensors like a fingerprint or heart rate sensor. Sometimes even a skin conductivity sensor, which measures basically how excited you are. This is also something that's already possible to turn into a privacy issue once again. So if you have like the new Apple Watch with actually has an ECG, electrocardiograph included, then this might be quite medically sensitive data that maybe you don't want everybody to know. Some devices have touch sensors also on the back of the device, so you can do additional input on the back side. We have notification LEDs. We have, of course, the location sensors. Sometimes we have additional buttons. The important aspect, I think, to keep in mind here is that all of these together are a very, very broad field of different options we have for input and output. And so people or especially manufacturers are probably a bit reluctant to use too many of them beyond what people are just used to, which is touch. So to be not too kind of outlandish or exotic in a way. But there's lots of research projects in that space, which we're going to look at in a bit more detail later. All right. Yeah, I already summarized that.